So, welcome to the first SCI 135 lecture. Biology is the study of life. So, the first chapter, we're going to talk about what makes something life, what makes something alive. If you do need to get a hold of me, and you're not coming in for the labs, there's some people that for one reason or another are not coming in for the labs, or if you need to get a hold of me in sometime other than during the lab, these are the times that I should be accessible by this phone number, 8864, that's the extension in the lab. Remember, I'm not in my office, this is my office. So I should be around these times. There may be an occasional day where for one reason or another I'm not, but that would be very unusual. I'm recording this in the end of July. I'm in here during most of these hours, and it's July, so it's not that hard to get a hold of me. Keep in mind that most questions that you're going to have, it's in the syllabus. Is that we went over that with the introductory class, where I used the projector from the computer. From now on, I'm going to use this. This is an old-fashioned overhead projector, and I'm going to write the stuff that goes up here, and I'm going to have these fun little things that go up as well. I mentioned this in the introductory thing that I put out for the summer. I'm going to try to present this the same way that I would present a regular class. So you're going to be watching me write on the overhead and talk, right? Step away, add to the stuff that I put up there. How much or how little you need to write down so that you can remember this stuff later is totally individual to you. Is that some people will write just what I've got up here and then they'll remember everything else. Some people are going to be scrambling like crazy. Well, the good news is you got this on video. So if I get a little ahead of you, you can stop the video and catch up, or you can go back. If at some point later on you're looking at your notes and it doesn't really make much sense, here's a little hint. As you're going through the videos, is that there should be a timestamp. On my screen, it's way up here. On yours, it may be down at the bottom. Every 5-10 minutes or so, put a little time next to your notes, so that if you're going through your notes in a few weeks and you hit a point and you go, oh man, I thought this was going to make sense, but now I don't remember it well enough. Well, if your timestamp says 10 minutes in, or it's between 10 and 20 minutes, then you're going to be able to go to the video and scan through and not have to watch the whole video again in order to find the thing. You can scan through for whatever's on the overhead. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this. And this adds, doing this remotely adds another level of complexity, but it's not an impossible level of complexity. What makes something alive? The dippy answer is, it can die. Not a useful answer. Is it, what is anything? Is it's not that. Is that that's not a good answer for pretty much anything that you do. So there are lists. There are things that living things have in common. Every biology class gives you the list. The list goes in different orders in different classes. The bullet points may be a little bit different, but the list all adds up to the same list pretty much. And so we're just going to go through my version of the list and talk about what makes things alive. So, features of life. First feature. Living things are complicated, but they're organized. Is it they pull everything together and get it to work? Right now, well, there's a whole bunch of different stuff happening inside your body, in your chemistry and in your cells. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, And one of the things that happens is, so people learn how the viruses work. They find something the virus is doing and they go, why don't we shut that off? And so somebody tries to do that with poor little animal models probably, and finds out that one whole system craps out on you and everybody dies, all the mice die. And everybody's in the lab is looking at each other going, why did that chemical affect that system? Do we know how this chemical, we didn't even know it worked in that system. Well, I guess it does. This is one of the ways we put things together. We put things together by screwing stuff up. Is that a lot of medicine is learned by trying something, and when it doesn't work a particular way, it gives you clues about what's going on. But there's a lot of machinery to muck about with anytime you're trying to deal with living things. Even something as simple as a single cell is very intricate and very organized. Now, in life on Earth, we've got a particular type of organization. All of our chemistry is protein-based, and by that it means it's all runs through particular types of proteins called enzymes. We'll get into that a little bit later, but nothing really happens in your cells except that there's enzymes helping it happen. Is all of our chemistry in our cells, or in a bacterium cell, or in a mushroom cell, or in a maple tree's cell. It's all protein-based chemistry. There's things other than proteins in there working, but every bit of the working depends on proteins to put stuff where it's supposed to go, and get stuff to do what it's supposed to do, and get stuff started when it's supposed to get started, and stop stuff when it's supposed to stop. So our chemistry is all running off of these molecules called proteins. But the one thing about our protein-based chemistry is, in order to pass on the ability to make all of our proteins, like I want my kids to be able to make all the proteins I can make. Well, I don't pass that on in protein form. The code that I pass on is a different form. Living things on this planet, who knows, this may or may not be the way that they would, if there's living things elsewhere, it may use a different system. With all of the permutations and the possibilities of the atoms and stuff, it's probably not going to use a significantly different, it would use a recognizable system. And how do we make proteins? We have codes in our cells that hold the formulas for every single protein that you use. Those codes are called genes. Is that, here's something I'm going to ask you a bunch of times, and it's going to come up a bunch of times. What is a gene? Well, for us, there's some very loose general definitions, but this is a science class. We got a very specific definition. A gene is a DNA code for a particular type of protein. So for all those different proteins that were helping us do our chemistry and hold our cells together and connect our cells to each other and do all the various things that proteins do, is that every one of those, each type of protein has its own gene. So you have a gene for the enzyme that breaks down cane sugar. You have a gene for the protein that does hold your cells together. You have a gene for a protein that makes your bones somewhat flexible and helps you to make things like cartilage. You have genes for every single protein that we make. Still on the internal organization, life on Earth is compartmentalized. All of our life processes happen in these special containers called cells. A cell is covered with a slightly, somewhat waterproof coating, a cell membrane, that allows the the chemistry inside the cells. Sorry, I didn't turn the volume down on my computer. That's my email going off. The chemistry that happens in your cells, because it's got this barrier around it, can work differently than the cell next to it or the juice around the cells. And so this ability to isolate a clump of chemistry is a very, very important thing, and cells is how we do that. If you were to do a survey of life on Earth, and then you had to summarize for somebody, they'd go, so what's life on Earth like? You go, well, it's mostly unicellular. It's mostly single-celled living things. Because the living things that are single cells, the bacteria and some of the single cells that are more like our cells, they outnumber us by a huge amount. Here's how much they outnumber us. If you were to put all of the unicellular, all the single-celled living things on one side of a giant, giant balance, and all of the multi-celled things on the other side, so that would include all the trees and the whales and the funguses and the plants and all the animals, it's all the stuff that's multi-celled, the single-celled guys would still outweigh us. So there'd be a lot more of them, and they'd pile up to a huge amount of mass. So there's way more living things on this planet that are single-celled. We're the exception, they're the rule. We are multicellular. Or multi-celled. Now a lot of people like a world that comes in either ors. This looks like a good either or, right? What else is there? Single-celled, multi-celled, one cell, more than one cell. How can there be anything different? It turns out there is a gray zone in between. There's a type of existence called colonial. There's all sorts of different species that are colonial. We're one of them. Basically, a colonial species is a species that in its natural state, individuals don't exist all by themselves. They exist in a group, and it isn't just a group of hanging out together. It's a group where when you get together in the group, different individuals in the group do different jobs that kind of support the whole group. Think of how people work, right? We're kind of all doing our own things, but you know, I'm doing my job that's relating to you. You may be going off to work and doing a job that supports society in another way. Is that we all have our own contributions and inputs, and that's true in some single-celled organisms. Okay, if they're doing this, why are they single-celled? I'll give you an example. Right now in the middle of the summertime, you may look, there's some ponds that have a very Kelly green kind of appearance. Not a bluish green, that's a different type of critter. But the Kelly green, if you were to dip a glass in and hold it up to the light, you got really good eyes, you don't need a microscope, you'd see little bitty floating green balls in the water. Under a microscope, they would look like dotty spheres. Each dot is an individual cell in the sphere. And in the sphere, some of them are helping the sphere to move. They're not eating. Some of them are pulling food in and sharing the nutrition with the things that are not eating. Some of them are reproducing more cells, and the other cells are not reproducing. That's a colonial existence, is that different cells are doing different things. Now, what makes them single cell? If you were to disrupt that sphere, pull it all apart, every one of those cells could live by itself. It could feed itself, it could move around, it could reproduce. They just don't like to do that. Just like if you take us and you isolate us, we theoretically could exist by ourselves, doing our, everything we need to do to survive, but we'd be terrible at it. We work much better in groups. So this kind of single-celled organisms that kind of work like they're multi-celled organisms, that's the gray zone between single-celled and multi-celled. So you didn't have to make a big jump way, way, way back when from one to the other. You could go through this kind of gray zone where, and there's still things around doing that. Still working the cells. As people were able to see really well under microscopes, they found that there were bits and pieces that they could see, and they could mess with them chemically, and they could watch them under a microscope and watch them do stuff. And they found that there were bits and pieces in cells that were doing jobs inside the cells. And you know, who knows who did this, but at some point somebody went, you know, it's kind of like organs in a body, you know. We have all these different things in us and each one does its job. This is kind of like organs in a body. And you know, some bright guy came up with, well, we won't call them organs, that'll be too confusing. Let's call them organelles. Like, that's not confusing. But that's what an organelle is. Your cell isn't just doing everything everywhere. It has a nucleus where DNA gets processed, the code gets processed. It's got organelles that make the proteins. It's got organelles that help stuff get in and out of the cells. It's got organelles that move stuff from one part of another of the cell to another. We'll talk about these later in the semester. But this is part of our organization. That organ thing shows up in a lot of ways. So we're cells that can be organized into groups of cells, into multi-celled systems, but even inside our cells, there's organization, not just the molecules, but the bits and pieces. In multi-celled systems, at least in plants and animals, there are certain classes of cells that do special jobs. Like they may be linings, or they may be nervous function, or they may be muscles function, or they may be holding us together. Those special classes of cells are called tissues. There's not a heck of a lot of them. Is that animals only have 4 or 5 different types of tissues, plants only have 5 or 6 different types of tissues, and everything kind of falls into those categories. But that's a level of organization. You put a bunch of tissues together, and you get something like a stomach. A bunch of tissues work together to help a stomach to work. It's got linings, it's got muscle, it's got a layer that holds the insides to the outsides, all those different types of tissues in it. Each one there doing a particular job. The difference between organs and structures is a fuzzy one, is that if something is not doing anything terribly complex, sometimes it'll just get called a structure. But not everybody agrees. Some books that deal with this stuff would call a bone an organ, some books would call a bone a structure. Everybody would call a stomach an organ, or a brain an organ. But your windpipe, organ or structure, gonna be different in different books, but you get the basic idea. A whole bunch of tissues get together and they do something special, sometimes more than one something special. Some of our organs are multi-purpose types of organs. Your liver does about 20 different things. Your stomach doesn't really do, it does one thing. It takes the big molecules in the food you eat and throws a bunch of acid at them to get them to unwind so that you're gonna be able to break them down into bits and pieces later. And it snips them into bits. I'm skipping over, we have systems of organs. We have a digestive system, we have a nervous system, we have a circulation system, we have an immune system, we got a whole bunch of different systems. But you put them all together, you put all the organs together, you put all the systems together, and you have individual organisms. Organisms. There's that organ thing again. Organisms, living things, same thing. I'll go, either way. I may talk about living things, I may talk about organisms. Organisms is the more technical biological term. If you're doing reading, it's going to show up a lot, so you kind of need to know what it means. But I don't necessarily use that term myself a lot, as I try to keep things simple when I'm talking about them. As I will have to throw the jargon at you, because you need to be familiar with it to do any reading or understand a lot of stuff that you're going to run into in the world that deals with biology. So what happens when you put a bunch of individuals together? Well, if they're all the same type of individual, then you've got a population. So this kind of matches the way that that it works in English language, right? What's a population? Well, it's all the people with something in common. You know, all the people that live in a city, all the people that live in a state, all the people that have a certain ethnic background, all the people that are a certain age. And here, it's all the organisms that belong to a particular species. So, and it's not just all of them everywhere. You may be looking, say, at the population of orb weaver spiders on the campus, or in the county, or in the state, or even in your backyard. But the population word implies that you're looking at things that are like one another, have something all in common. Now, above this, say you want to study the spiders. Well, spiders are predators. Predators need prey. Spiders very often depend on certain types of plants in order to set up their webs, or to be in hiding, or to put protective dens together. So a lot of living things work with a lot of other living things. And when you start to put a bunch of populations together, however you're connecting them, then you're talking about communities of living things, of different types of living things. Is that you could do the community of living things in your backyard, except you have to pick and choose, because we don't even know all the different species of things that were in your backyard. So you want to study the spiders, and you want to deal with all the different living things that they come in contact with that are important to them. Well, their environment that isn't living is important too. How long are the summers? How nasty are the winters? How rainy is it? What are the temperature fluctuations? That's your ecosystem. Your ecosystem takes all, well, you can see we're building the levels here, is that all the living things and the non-living things that are important in a particular, again, a place. So it could be the ecosystem of your yard, the ecosystem of the state, the ecosystem of a continent or a planet. They call the whole planet's ecosystem the biosphere. I'm not putting that on the list. Okay, so we're through internal organization as the first thing on the list. We're talking about what makes things alive. Alive, not alive. Certainly looks alive to me. But we'll have to see. I mean, it's capable of movement and response, so it probably has internal organization. Being able to respond to things is going to be on the list as well. But we are going to stop here.